Let me be straight with you. What I'm about to tell you is one of those stories that sounds completely made up until you realize every single piece of it is already happening right now in the real world. Picture this, a factory sitting in Shanghai that manufactures jet fuel, the exact same fuel that powers America's Delta flights, every commercial aircraft you've ever stepped onto, except this factory has no oil wells, no drilling rigs, no pipeline running underneath it, and no tanker ships delivering barrels of crude from halfway around the world. Instead, it has machines. Machines that literally pull carbon dioxide out of the open air, combine it with hydrogen that was split from plain water using solar energy, and through a remarkably precise chemical process, produce liquid fuel that is molecularly identical to what refineries have been pumping out of crude oil for over 100 years. Not similar, not a substitute, identical. You could take a sample from this factory and a sample from a traditional refinery and put them side by side in a lab, and the chemist running the test would not be able to tell you which one came from a barrel of oil and which one came from thin air and sunlight. That is not a future possibility. That is what is happening right now in January 2026 at a facility called Carbonology operating in the Lingang district of Shanghai, China. And if that alone were the story, it would be extraordinary enough. But here's the part that should really get your attention. This is just one of 6 completely separate technological breakthroughs that China has running simultaneously, each one solving a different piece of what might be the most consequential puzzle of the 21st century. Not 6 research papers, not 6 pilot projects buried in university basements, 6 active operational technologies. And by the time you finish watching this video, you are going to understand exactly what that puzzle is, why solving it shifts the balance of global power in ways that most Americans haven't even begun to think about, and why the energy world you grew up in, the one that ran on oil wells and tanker ships and geopolitics, is already in the process of becoming something completely unrecognizable. But before we get to the breakthroughs, we have to talk about the problem, because without understanding the problem, none of this makes sense. China is the second largest economy on the planet. Its factories manufacture a staggering share of everything that Americans buy, everything that Europeans buy, everything that the rest of the world consumes. Its cities have exploded with growth at a pace that has almost no historical parallel. And every single bit of that growth, every factory running overnight, every city lit up, every cargo ship loaded with goods, has been powered by energy that China does not actually produce itself. More than 70% of China's oil comes from foreign countries, the Middle East, Africa, Russia. That dependency alone is enormous, but the deeper vulnerability isn't even about where the oil comes from. It's about how it gets there. Every barrel, without exception, has to be loaded onto a tanker and shipped across the ocean. And almost all of those tankers, carrying almost all of that oil, have to pass through one specific body of water. A narrow passage between the islands of Malaysia and Indonesia called the Strait of Malacca. And when I say narrow, I'm not using that word loosely. At its tightest point, the Strait of Malacca is less than 3 kilometers wide. That is not a shipping lane, that is a keyhole. A single geographic keyhole that an economy of 1.4 billion people has to thread every single day just to keep its factories running. On any given day, roughly a quarter of all the oil traded anywhere on the planet passes through that keyhole. For China, the concentration is even higher. If that passage were ever blocked by military conflict, by accident, by a decision from someone who controls the waters around it, Chinese factories don't slow down gradually. They stop, supply chains freeze within days, prices spike. The ripple effects hit every country that buys Chinese goods, which in the modern economy means pretty much every country on Earth. Military strategists have had a name for this vulnerability for years. They call it the Malacca Dilemma. And the core of it is simple. China does not control the Strait of Malacca. It never has. And in a serious geopolitical crisis, someone else could, which means someone else could essentially hold an off switch over the second largest economy in the world. China has spent decades trying to find workarounds, pipelines across Central Asia, deep water ports negotiated in Pakistan and Myanmar, massive underground reserves of emergency oil storage. But all of those solutions are patches on the same wound. The oil still has to come from somewhere else. It still has to cross an ocean. The fundamental vulnerability never actually went away. The only thing that could genuinely change the equation is energy that doesn't need to move at all. Energy made precisely where it's needed, from raw materials that exist literally everywhere on the surface of this planet. That is the problem these 6 technologies were built to solve. And the first one, Carbonology's jet fuel, is as elegant an answer as you could imagine. Think about how a plant works for a second. A tree doesn't pump oil out of the ground to power its growth. It takes carbon dioxide from the air around it and sunlight hitting its leaves, and through photosynthesis, it builds complex organic molecules from basically nothing. What Carbonology figured out is how to do something remarkably similar, except instead of building a leaf, they're building kerosene. The process begins with what engineers call direct air capture, essentially giant industrial fans pulling atmospheric air through materials that grab onto carbon dioxide molecules and hold them. The same CO2 that climate scientists have been warning about for decades, the same gas that's coming out of every tailpipe and smokestack, gets collected in massive quantities and redirected into the production process. At the same time, solar panels power a process called electrolysis, which splits ordinary water molecules into their 2 components: oxygen, which is released back into the atmosphere, and hydrogen, which becomes the second key ingredient. When you combine that captured carbon dioxide with that solar-produced hydrogen under carefully controlled temperature and pressure conditions, the molecules rearrange themselves into hydrocarbon chains, the same long-chain molecules that define petroleum-based fuels. What comes out at the end of the process is not a biofuel, not an alternative fuel, not a sustainable option. It is chemically molecularly, structurally the same as conventional jet fuel. You could pump it into any aircraft engine on Earth and the engine would perform identically. There would be no modification required, no compatibility issue, no performance trade-off. This matters enormously from a commercial standpoint because the European Union has already passed binding legislation requiring that 2% of all aviation fuel come from sustainable sources starting now, climbing all the way to 70% by 2050. That means even before synthetic fuel becomes cost competitive with conventional jet fuel, which it will, as production scales, there are already guaranteed buyers lined up at the door. The market was legally mandated before the product was even fully operational, which is one of the most remarkable commercial setups in modern industrial history. Carbonology started at a test line producing about 100 tons per year. The next milestone is a 1,000-ton demonstration facility, then 5,000 tons, then a full commercial plant targeting 100,000 tons annually by 2027. Major investment funds, including Sequoia China, have already committed serious capital to the project, which tells you something important. The people who get paid to look very carefully at whether a technology actually works and whether the numbers actually add up decided this one does. But making fuel is only one piece of what China is building. Because even if you can manufacture fuel anywhere, you still have a massive unsolved problem staring you in the face. What do you do with solar and wind energy when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing? This is a question that has haunted renewable energy for as long as renewables have existed, and it doesn't have an easy answer. The sun powers everything beautifully during daylight hours, and then it sets. And suddenly you have a city full of factories and hospitals and data centers that need continuous power, and your solar panels are producing nothing. Most conversations about this problem focus on batteries, and batteries are genuinely useful. But the largest lithium-ion battery storage installations in the world today can hold about 4 to 5 hours of output. That's workable for managing peak demand fluctuations. It is completely inadequate for getting through a long winter night or a week of cloudy weather, or keeping a major industrial operation running through the dark hours without interruption. In late 2025, out in the Gobi Desert, China turned on a storage system that approaches this problem from a direction so different that the first time you hear about it, your instinct is to laugh. They freeze air. That's the whole concept. Take ordinary ambient air, the stuff you're breathing right now, and cool it down to negative 194 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, the air doesn't stay a gas, it becomes a liquid. A pale blue, eerily cold liquid that you can pour into insulated tanks and store for as long as you need. Every bit of the solar energy that went into cooling it is now locked up in that liquid, waiting. When you need electricity, you open the valves. The liquid air begins to warm up. As it does, it expands. And here's where the physics gets dramatic. It expands to 750 times its liquid volume. That's not a gradual expansion. That's a controlled explosion of volume, and when you channel that expanding gas through turbines, you get rotation, you get generators, you get electricity flowing back into the grid. The Gobi Desert facility is paired with a 250 megawatt solar farm. During the day, any excess solar power that the local grid doesn't immediately need goes into making liquid air instead of being wasted. At night, that liquid air releases all of its stored energy back as electricity, running continuously for 10 straight hours. 10 hours! More than double the discharge duration of the world's largest lithium battery installations. And it does this without a single gram of lithium, without any cobalt, without rare earth minerals that have to be mined in politically complicated places and shipped halfway around the world. The raw material is air, the running cost is the electricity to cool it. The infrastructure is industrial refrigeration equipment and turbines, technologies that have been around for over a century. The facility produces roughly 180 gigawatt hours of energy storage per year, and it has been running continuously since late 2025. That is a functioning, operational solution to the renewable energy storage problem that has been blocking clean energy's path to reliability for decades. But even with that solved, there's still another category of energy demand that batteries and grid storage can't touch: the industries that don't run on electricity at all. Cargo ships crossing the Pacific, chemical plants running high-temperature industrial processes, steel mills that need intense, sustained heat. These industries need a physical fuel, something they can store in tanks, ship to wherever the vessel or the plant happens to be, and burn on demand. And for this problem, China's answer involves a molecule that most Americans associate primarily with window cleaner: ammonia, simple and inexpensive everywhere. You almost certainly have a bottle of it under your kitchen sink. But in the context of clean energy, ammonia is one of the most strategically important molecules on the planet, and here's why. Hydrogen is an incredible fuel. When you burn it, the only byproduct is water vapor. No carbon, no greenhouse gases, no pollution of any kind. The problem is that hydrogen by itself is extraordinarily difficult to transport in large quantities. It's the lightest element in the universe. Keeping it compressed enough and cold enough to move across oceans in meaningful amounts requires engineering that is both technically demanding and extremely expensive. Ammonia solves that problem entirely. You can chemically lock hydrogen inside ammonia molecules. 3 hydrogen atoms bonded to 1 nitrogen atom. Ship that ammonia across the ocean the same way you'd ship any industrial liquid, and then at the destination, crack the ammonia back apart to release pure hydrogen. Ammonia is essentially a hydrogen carrier, a way to package clean energy for long-distance transport that uses infrastructure that already exists worldwide. The reason this matters so much is that traditionally, making ammonia has always required enormous amounts of natural gas, extremely high temperatures, and crushing pressure. The process is called the Haber-Bosch process, and it has been responsible for producing the nitrogen fertilizer that feeds roughly half the world's entire population since the early 20th century. It has also always been one of the most fossil fuel-intensive industrial processes on Earth. In Shanxi province in China, that just changed. There is now a fully operational solar-powered ammonia production plant running at a 100-ton scale. It operates at room temperature, no extreme heat, no crushing pressure, no natural gas input. Nitrogen is pulled directly from the atmosphere, hydrogen comes from solar-powered electrolysis of water, and ammonia is produced continuously and efficiently. This plant has run for over 1,200 hours without interruption. That's more than 50 straight days of continuous operation at over 90% efficiency. The implications reach far beyond agriculture. Japan and South Korea are already actively testing ammonia-powered cargo vessels in real ocean conditions. If the global shipping industry, which moves approximately 90% of everything that is bought and sold anywhere in the world, transitions even partially to ammonia as its primary fuel, then the oil currently powering those ships doesn't just become more expensive. It becomes optional, not price competitive, not gradually phased out over decades. Optional. As in, you could just not use it anymore. Now step back for a moment and look at the pattern here, because there's something important connecting all 3 of these technologies that goes deeper than the individual breakthroughs. Synthetic jet fuel needs hydrogen to combine with captured carbon dioxide. Liquid air energy storage enables large-scale clean electricity production, and hydrogen production is powered by clean electricity. Solar ammonia synthesis needs hydrogen as its primary ingredient. Pull the thread and you find the same molecule at the center of every single one of these systems. Hydrogen. Hydrogen is not just a fuel in this picture. It is the connective tissue, the common currency, the raw material that makes the entire clean energy ecosystem function. Which means the real strategic question, the question that will define which countries hold leverage over this new energy system the same way oil reserves defined leverage in the old one, is who produces the most hydrogen, how fast they can scale that production, and who builds and sells the machines that make hydrogen production possible. In 2019, China's annual production of green hydrogen, hydrogen made from renewable electricity rather than natural gas, sat at around 23,000 tons. By 2024, that number had grown to 125,000 tons annually. A six-fold increase in 5 years, and the pace is still accelerating. The province of Guangdong alone is currently building an offshore wind project specifically designed to power electrolyzers, the machines that split water into hydrogen, targeting 80,000 tons of green hydrogen production per year from a single project in a single province. But the number that might matter most of all is this one. China currently manufactures 65% of all the electrolyzers installed anywhere on Earth. Electrolyzers are the critical hardware of the hydrogen economy. They are the device that converts electricity and water into hydrogen, which is the input that makes synthetic fuels, clean ammonia, and green chemical production all possible. If you control 65% of the manufacturing capacity of that device globally, you don't just control your own clean energy transition. You significantly influence the pace and cost of everyone else's, because every country building a hydrogen economy needs to buy the machines from somewhere. Beijing has made its position on hydrogen completely explicit in official policy. Hydrogen now has the same legal status in Chinese national energy law as oil and gas, a designation that carries enormous weight in terms of government investment priority, regulatory support, and long-term planning commitment. The government has set a target of driving the price of green hydrogen below 25 yuan per kilogram by 2030 and committed 33 billion yuan in direct investment to get there. Compare the supply chain of hydrogen to the supply chain of oil for just a moment, because the contrast tells you everything you need to know about why this transition is so fundamentally disruptive to the existing global order. Moving a barrel of crude oil from a well in Saudi Arabia or Iraq to a factory in China involves drilling the well, pumping the oil, loading it onto a super tanker, sailing that tanker through the Persian Gulf across the Indian Ocean, through the Strait of Malacca, up to a Chinese port, unloading, refining, and distributing, with fuel price exposure and geopolitical risk at every single step along the way. Green hydrogen made from air and water using solar power has a supply chain that fits inside one industrial building. No wells, no tankers, no straits, no OPEC meetings. No price spike when a drone strikes a refinery in Riyadh. The cost falls every year as solar panels get cheaper and electrolyzers get more efficient. The raw materials, water and sunlight, are available on every continent. The transition happening in China's own industrial base reflects just how real this shift has become. The country's largest oil refining company saw its profits drop 37% in 2025. Not because economic activity collapsed, because alternatives are beginning to offer competitive economics. And the company's response wasn't to lobby against clean energy or to double down on petroleum. It committed the equivalent of nearly 800 million yuan to convert an existing gasoline and diesel production facility into a sustainable aviation fuel plant, literally rebuilding itself around synthetic fuel while it's still operating at profit. That is not a warning signal about a distant future. That is a company making a capital allocation decision in real time based on where it can see the market going. But here's the dimension of this story that almost all the coverage completely misses. Because everything I've described so far, the synthetic fuel, the liquid air storage, the clean ammonia, all of it still depends on an input that has to be generated from somewhere. Solar power, wind power, clean electricity of some form. These technologies are extraordinarily powerful, but they're still working with an energy supply that fluctuates with the weather and the time of day. You can store it, you can manage it. You can build systems sophisticated enough to smooth out the variability almost completely. But at a fundamental physical level, you're still chasing a power source that isn't always available on demand. The truly final frontier in this entire story, the technology that could theoretically make every other clean energy technology exponentially more powerful, is one that most people have been hearing about for so long without results that they've essentially stopped believing it will ever arrive. Fusion energy, the same process the sun uses to generate its light and heat. In fusion, two light atoms are forced together at temperatures measured in tens of millions of degrees. When they fuse, they release a burst of energy that is orders of magnitude larger than anything you get from burning a chemical fuel. And the outputs are extraordinary. No carbon dioxide, no long-lived radioactive waste, no fuel source that can be bought and sold and blockaded. The fuel for fusion is hydrogen, and hydrogen comes from water, which covers 70% of the surface of this planet. China's primary fusion research device is called EAST, the Experimental Advanced Superconducting Tokamak, and in 2026 it crossed a significant experimental threshold, sustaining plasma at the conditions necessary for fusion for longer than any previous attempt in the facility's history, pushing past what researchers call the Greenwald limit for plasma stability. This is not a finished technology. Fusion is still years away from being a commercial power source, but the research trajectory is clear. The investment levels are substantial, and the implication for everything else in this story is profound. Every single technology described in this video, synthetic fuels, liquid air storage, clean ammonia, green hydrogen, becomes dramatically more powerful and dramatically cheaper when the underlying energy source is unlimited, always available, and costs essentially nothing per unit. Synthetic fuel production could scale to any volume you needed. Hydrogen output would become effectively limitless. Liquid air storage would become a backbone for a global energy grid that never runs short. Even emerging work in artificial photosynthesis, where Chinese research labs have engineered bacteria capable of converting carbon dioxide and sunlight directly into industrial chemicals, would transform from a scientific curiosity into a complete manufacturing foundation. Each of these technologies is impressive in isolation. Stack them on top of each other with fusion power underneath, and you have something that has never existed before in the entire history of human civilization. A fully closed-loop energy system. You put in air, water, and clean electricity. You get out liquid fuel, stored energy, fertilizer, industrial chemicals. Nothing extracted from the ground. Nothing shipped across oceans in vulnerable tankers. Nothing dependent on the geography of where geological luck happened to deposit organic material hundreds of millions of years ago. And that is the point where this story stops being about technology and starts being about power in the oldest sense of the word. For the last 100 years, global power, real hard, strategic power, has been inseparable from oil. You either had oil reserves or you had the military capacity to control the shipping routes that oil traveled through. The Persian Gulf, the Strait of Malacca, the pipelines running through Central Asia, these weren't just geographic features. They were leverage points. They were the reason certain countries sat at certain tables in certain negotiations. They were the reason the United States built and maintained a blue water navy capable of projecting force anywhere on Earth. The whole architecture of 20th century geopolitics was organized at a fundamental level around the fact that energy had to come from specific places on the map and travel to everywhere else. But if energy can be manufactured exactly where it's needed, from ingredients, air and water, that exist in equal abundance on every continent, then that geography stops being power. The reserves stop being leverage. The choke points stop being strategic. The country that sits on the largest oil field loses the advantage that field has given it for a century. And the country that builds and sells the machines that make energy from air and water inherits a different kind of influence. The kind that comes not from controlling a resource, but from controlling the technology that makes a resource unnecessary. China already manufactures 65% of the world's solar panels. It dominates global electrolyzer production. It is actively exporting the infrastructure of the clean energy economy, solar panels, wind turbines, battery systems, electrolyzers, to countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the same way oil-producing nations once exported barrels of crude. The product is completely different. The strategic logic is identical. Over 1 billion gallons of new renewable and synthetic fuel capacity is moving into Chinese production pipelines in the course of this year alone. Hydrogen output is multiplying at a pace that would have seemed implausible 5 years ago. Major industrial facilities built on petroleum inputs are being actively converted to synthetic fuel production while they're still operating. These are not government projections in a 5-year plan. This is construction. This is capital deployed. This is equipment running. The world that ran on oil didn't announce its own ending. It didn't hold a press conference or publish a white paper. It just started, very quietly, losing ground, one cleaner, cheaper, more reliable technology at a time, one factory conversion at a time, one investment decision at a time, to something that didn't need oil wells or tanker fleets or geopolitical alliances built around protecting shipping lanes. That transition is already happening. It's happening in the Gobi Desert and in Shanxi Province and in the Lingang district of Shanghai. It's happening in the capital allocation decisions of oil companies that are rebuilding themselves around synthetic inputs. It's happening in the electrolyzer factories and the solar panel supply chains and the offshore wind farms being built right now. And the question that Americans in particular need to be asking, because the United States has built its strategic posture, its military alliances, its energy infrastructure, and a significant part of its economic advantage around the existing energy order, is not whether this transition is happening. It clearly is. The question is whether the country that led the world through the oil age is going to lead through what comes next, or whether it's going to spend the next decade still debating whether the transition is real while the machines that define the next century are being manufactured somewhere else. That is the conversation that matters, and it is happening whether we pay attention to it or not.